may continue with the elements of 101, getting into the object effect distinction. Hopefully, yeah, that should, probably won't complete the object effect distinction, but if that's the case, we'll continue with it on Monday. Let's start again with concerted practice. Now, presumably all of you have read Article 101, and you'll know that in addition to agreements, which are anti-competitive, that article also prohibits anti-competitive concerted practices. A concerted practice, as we saw last time, is that stage of understanding or cooperation among undertakings prior to an agreement, whether the agreement's explicit or just generally well understood, prior to an agreement where cooperation is substituted for vigorous competition and the risks associated with competition. Okay? Typically, concerted practices consist in the sharing of information. Okay? Providing what would otherwise be or regarded as confidential or significant commercial information to someone else who's active in the market. Okay? Your intentions of future pricing, your intentions of expanding into certain areas, your intentions to withdraw from certain areas. Okay? What may or may not be in your research and development pipeline. All of that sort of information, okay, is sharing that is typically regarded as anti-competitive. Why else would you inform a competitor what you plan to do with respect to your prices next month? Why would you do that? Is there any legitimate business justification for that? There may be, but it's highly unlikely. Okay? There are a few cases where sharing of this information is permissible, but mostly it isn't. Okay? Concerted practices do not require a meeting of the minds. Okay? None of this sort of concurrence of wills, meeting of minds, or however else you wish to put it. It's merely joint.
I have a question. What's the meaning of minds?
It's the meeting of minds is a phrase used in the common law of contract when two people arrive at a common understanding. It's their agreement. Okay, so their minds meet among a common understanding. Okay, and that's often used in the common law principles of contract. Arguably, if the two parties don't have a meeting of the minds, then there's no agreement as to the scope or nature of the contract, right? Okay? Now, the Dole case, again, yet another bananas case, involved exchange of information. If you want to understand how the banana market in the EU works, read the Dole case. Okay, it describes exactly how bananas are done and what prices are used as benchmarks. Okay, what's key in Dole is it emphasizes what we could call a fundamental principle of EU competition law, namely that each economic operator, each undertaking, must independently determine the policy that the undertaking intends to adopt in the common market. Okay? So a common understanding of policy, or a shared conception of policy, or an agreed conception of policy is viewed as an affront to the EU's competition principles. Okay. And then a couple of things here. First of all, although economic operators, although undertakings must adopt their own policies on the market, first of all, they can, of course, as they say, intelligently use the existing or anticipated conduct of their competitors. In other words, if I can figure out, or if I have a reasonable idea of what you are going to be doing in the next quarter, I can take my idea into account when I plan my own policy. What's wrong is you sharing that plan with me. Okay? So you can adapt to what your competitors are doing. You just can't share the information. Okay? And so that paragraph is key. So, exchanges of information between competitors, even if the exchanges of information are not part of an agreement or don't constitute an agreement, exchanges of information where it reduces or removes the degree of uncertainty, okay, are viewed as anti-competitive. Okay? Yes?
Yes, I have a question. That reductions, that means it's likely so the asset comes.
It's usually likely, okay, where there's a good chance that it will be, okay? You would, there's always, okay, but now, you know, there's always room for a defense that the sharing of information actually has a valid commercial reason. Okay? There's one case, which actually I'll mention now, and we'll see it. I'll mention it now. We'll see it in greater detail over the next little while. It's what's known as the wood pulp case. Okay? The Style of Cause is a Finnish company, and if you are aware of the Finnish language, it's full of very long words. Okay? That are unlike most other European languages. In fact, Finnish is a branch. Basically, Finnish is its own set of language, not terribly well related to the rest of the Indo-European languages. Anyway, it's known as wood pulp 2. We'll get to this. Now, in wood pulp 2, okay, what was happening? There were two issues. The first issue is that the agreement and the practices occurred outside of the EU. Finland at the time was not a member of the EU. But it affected the European market. So that's a jurisdictional element. And it was held by the European Union courts that if a practice affects the European market, then EU law applies. Okay? So that's the jurisdictional element, the sort of the extraterritorial jurisdictional element. And that's a common principle for the application of competition law. If the practice affects a jurisdiction's market, that jurisdiction's antitrust or competition rules apply. So for instance, if you have a conspiracy to fix prices in Switzerland, and the prices are on the American market, the prices you're fixing are on the American market, American law applies, and you go to an American jail, because Americans criminalize that kind of behavior. Okay? If you fix prices in Switzerland, if you're in Switzerland and you fix prices on the Canadian market applies. If you fix prices on the European market, the European rules apply. Okay, even though you may not be in that country, your actions affect the markets of that country. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point in wood pulp is a very interesting one. Okay, what was going on in wood pulp, okay, was the wood pulp producers would announce their prices several months in advance. One producer would announce its price, and then a few days or a week or so later, another producer would announce their prices, but the prices would take effect several months in the future. Okay, now, do you know what wood pulp is and what wood pulp's used for? Okay, look down in front of you, paper. Okay, wood pulp is an essential element to paper production. You take the trees, you grind them down, you make a pulp out of it, and with the pulp are the fibers, and the fibers then become paper. Okay? Now, the claim was, okay, there was a valid commercial reason for announcing these prices, which would take effect a few months later. The valid commercial reason consisted in the demand by paper mills, by paper producers. The paper producers would buy the wood pulp and then take the wood pulp and turn it into paper. And then in turn they would sell their paper, typically in one form or another, as newsprint for newspapers. This was back in the days when people actually read physical newspapers as opposed to iPads with newspapers on them. Okay? Back in the old days. Okay. So the claim was that the newspapers wanted to know how much it would cost to print, to buy the newspapers, so that they could set a budget, because of course it would be the advertising budget or whatever that would allow them to buy the papers. So they know how much advertising to sell. And so they would make those demands from the paper mills. So the paper mills would need to know how much it would cost, how much the wood pulp would cost. So that was the commercial reason given. Okay? Because it helped consumers in their final, in their business planning. The court bought that and said, yes, this is a legitimate reason that explains why these advanced price announcements were not anti-competitive. Okay? The court accepted that. As an aside, this was one of the few times where the European Union courts appointed their own economic experts to assist the court. Some critics, and indeed some former counsel for the commission, have criticized the economic evidence that the court relied on, okay, as being probably incorrect. But nevertheless, that aside, the court accepted that in this case, there's a valid commercial reason for these prior price announcements. So what that means is, in EU law, if you can show that nonetheless the practice does promote a valid commercial reason, then it can be, not that it will be, but it can be exempted from EU competition, from 101 claims. We will see how this can be done when we look at the object and effect distinction later on. Probably, either at the end of this lecture or next lecture, or alternatively in the 101.3 justifications. Okay? The tourist cases, okay. This is an interesting case. Is how do we infer, or how can we conclude that an agreement or a concerted practice is present on a given market? And the tourist sort of sums up the case law and says a number of coincidences taken together, okay, can show that in the absence of another plausible explanation, can show that there's a violation of the competition rules. For instance, if there's a meeting, okay, if the market looks fairly competitive and prices are all over the place, and then there happens to be a meeting of senior people in the industry from all the firms, and then a week or so after, the prices seem to be a bit coordinated and focused on one thing, wouldn't you certainly want to know what went on in that meeting? I think that would be a good idea to find out, right? If, for instance, you notice that prices all of a sudden go up and seem to be moving up together, but the cost of the inputs, the raw materials, has remained the same, wouldn't you like to have a talk with somebody? I think that would probably be a good idea. So, another plausible explanation. Okay. And we will see that the EU has, as well as member states, has a fair number of investigative tools that they can use to gather, how should we say, evidence of these sorts of indicia. Okay, that is a concerted practice. So agreements, concerted practices, both are prohibited. Okay, and both will lead to fines. Remember I mentioned the T-Mobile case yesterday where somebody blurted it out. That was worth about several million euros. Okay, so it led to fines. Okay, effect on trade is another significant jurisdictional issue. Articles 101 and 102, both of the competition law articles, okay, require the practice to have an effect on trade between member states. This is the dividing line between the application of European competition rules and the application of member state competition rules. Okay? If there's an effect on trade between member states, okay, then the European rules apply. If the effect is only localized, okay, then typically only the member state rules apply. Example, prior to the EU's leaving, the UK's leaving, there was a problem in competition in buses in the Liverpool area, okay, in Bristol. That had no effect on member state trade, therefore it was a matter for the British competition authorities to deal with, not the European competition authorities to deal with. Okay? Now, let me make sure, let's mention it here. We'll get to that now. This is different from, okay, a de minimis. Okay? There's a commission notice that you will see, it's mentioned in your syllabus, on de minimis effects. Essentially, if the de minimis notice states that if the restriction on competition is very small, okay, it is unlikely to affect the market. Okay, why? Well, you have to be dominant you have to be a near monopoly to abuse the market, or if the practice or a practice must be shared by a large portion of those operating in the market for the market to be affected. Suppose two small grocers fix the price of lettuce. Okay? That probably isn't going to have any significant effect on the price of lettuce in any large area. Okay, it's a very small restriction on competition. Have a look at the de minimis notice. There's also some permitted cooperation. Okay, we'll get to these. These are the various block exemptions, which allow for undertakings to cooperate, for instance, in research and development, in marketing, in dealing with larger suppliers, for instance. Okay, and there's a series of block exemptions for various other industries that you really don't need to know. Okay, now, to consider an effect on trade, whether or not the practice has an effect on trade, the agreement as a whole must be considered. Okay? Parts of the agreement are not considered in abstract from the other, but the commercial effect or commercial consequences of the agreement, and if the agreement, for instance, is a contract that's commonly used in an industry, then this industrial use of this agreement must also be considered. Example, the De Limitis and Henniger-Brau case. It's in your syllabus in the book. It's a good case in point. Like I said, bananas and alcohol. You can teach EU competition law. This involves the latter. Okay? Mr. De Limitis, Sergio De Limitis, owned a pub in Germany. Okay? Now, a very common way to distribute beer and petrol in Europe is that the brewery or the petrol company tends to own the premises from which the beer or the petrol is sold. So brewers tend to own pubs. Oil companies own the Shell station down the street. Okay? They tend to be managed by a landlord, somebody who leases the premise and the like. And of course, there tends to be a tie. Obviously, the Shell station down the street can't buy its petrol from BP. Okay? Similarly, a pub tends to be tied to the brewer. That you can only buy your beer from the brewer that owns your pub. Okay? Very common throughout the EU. Okay. We're trying to relax that really as a result of some of the competition concerns. Now, Mr. De Limitis, okay, had this sort of lease agreement with Henniger-Brau. Okay? And he had to buy almost all of his beer from Henniger-Brau. He was allowed to sell a very small percentage of non-Henniger-Brau brewed beer. There's a tongue twister for me. Okay. He argued I think this was a Euro defense he wanted to get out of his contract. He argued that this restriction, okay, was void because it affected trade between member states. Because he couldn't sell a large portion, he couldn't sell much non-Henniger Brau brewed beer, okay, he couldn't, for instance, sell French beer in his pub. Believe it or not, some French beer is really good. Or Belgian beer in his pub. Okay. Now you're thinking, okay, how could it be? Mr. Delimitis is one pub in Germany. How could his contract somehow affect trade between member states? Right? That doesn't seem to be, this seems to be a bit off. But the issue is not Mr. Delimitis' contract, but the extensive use of similar contracts throughout Germany and throughout the EU. Right? It's not Mr. Delimitis. His opportunity, it's not just because Mr. Delimitis' opportunities to sell French beer were hindered, but the entire German pub industry's opportunities to sell French beer that hindered this effect on cross-border trade. You see that? It was a network of contracts, not just Mr. Delimitis and his participation, okay, but the agreement as a whole and the agreement in its wide commercial context. Okay. So you look at trade and may affect. Does the wide use of such contracts, can this affect trade between member states? Yes, it makes it very difficult, okay, if you're in Germany, to have a French or a Belgian or a Dutch beer with your meal at a pub. Does it exclude French, Dutch, and Belgian beers from the German pub market? Yes. Hence it affects trade. Appreciably is the next step. Okay. Okay, well, it just means more than a small or a trivial amount. Okay? So trade is not goods, just goods and services, but all cross-border activity. Right? The four freedoms in the EU, which are? Pardon? What are the four? Remember? Who studied EU laws in undergraduate? Do you remember this?
Movement of goods and services.
2.
People.
Free movement of people and?
Capital.
Capital and payments, yes. Okay, so goods, services, workers, employees. Okay, if it affects employees, and capital and payments. Okay, all cross an establishment, part of free movement of goods and services is this establishment being able to set up a business. Okay. Okay. And then the competitive practices affect the structure of the market. That's the Delimitis case again. Right? All of these, the network of these public agreements. Okay. And then it refers to the wood pulp. Okay. May affect. It can be possible to foresee. It means you can see that it's likely. There's a sufficient degree of probability. Okay. Of objective factors of law. It's not a weird fantasy, but there's some objective reason for you to see the agreement having an influence on the pattern of trade between member states. So does the pattern of, or is the pattern of trade between member states somehow affected? You would look at whether there's a sufficient degree of probability, how it influences this, and if there's a potential direct or influence on the pattern of trade. You just need to show that it can have the effect. You didn't need to show in, say, Mr. Delimitis' cases, how much beer was or wasn't sold, how much French beer was or wasn't sold, or how much Belgian beer was or wasn't sold. You just need to have a realization that it was capable of affecting that. And then anything that hinders, makes it more difficult, is also an affront. Okay. You need appreciability. Is it an appreciable effect? That's done on a case-by-case basis. And more than just a de minimis. It's okay. For your purposes, for the purposes of an exam, you can assume that it'll pass the that any restriction passes the de minimis threshold and passes the appreciability test. For practice, typically you'd have to have a look at the de minimis test. That will come from your economist's report. And if your client is complaining about it, or somebody is complaining about your client, then it's probably an appreciable effect. Okay. I have never seen a case dismissed by the European courts on the appreciability. Cases from the competition authorities, they may not take on a case, but typically they won't say it's they will not say it's because it didn't have an appreciable effect, but usually they'll use it's not high on our priorities as an excuse for not taking on a particular case. Okay? There's a rebuttable presumption of appreciability if you're dealing with 40 million euros or the market share is more than 5%. 40 million euros sounds like a big amount of money to us, right? Be nice to have 40 million euros in the bank account. Most of us wouldn't be here if we had 40 million euros in our bank account, right? Be honest. But in terms of European business of the sort that does cross-border trade, 40 million euros is not that much. Okay, in terms of, and that's just a volume. That's not a profit. That's just the volume of commerce. Okay, and 5% of a market is not really that much. Hold for questions, and I will go on. Ink annotations, whatever that is. Okay. Object and effect. We'll talk about this now. We'll get into this now. Okay. Object and effect. Okay. Object and effect deal with sort of the nature of the restrictions on competition. Okay. Let's talk about some initial restrictions. Okay. Ancillary restraints. Okay. Ancillary restraints. Ancillary restraints are typically secondary agreements which are directly or related to a primary agreement and are necessary to give effect to the primary agreement. Okay? Take, for instance, okay, here's an example. There's a hint there. Suppose I'm in the restaurant business. I run a really nice, successful restaurant in the south of Manchester, and I have a lineup of people every day, 7 days a week, coming into my restaurant. But I'm getting kind of tired of cooking every night. I really just want to retire. Okay? So I decided I'm going to retire, so I'm putting my restaurant up for sale as a going concern. You've got some extra money, that 40 million euros that we talked about, just burning a hole in your pocket, and you want to buy a restaurant. Okay? So you approach me and say, Bruce, I want to buy your restaurant. Chez Bruce is a really nice restaurant. Okay? So I say, fine, I'll sell you the restaurant, no problem. But what is one of your greatest fears? Okay? Obviously, keeping it's all around keeping the clients, keeping everybody happy, the food inspectors. But a really relevant fear would be after about 6 months, I get tired of sitting on the sofa every night, and I want to go back into the restaurant business and reopening a restaurant across the street from me. Wouldn't that just be awful? Right? Okay. Because you've just spent a good chunk of your 40 million euros. I'm just taking that away, and then you have a nice business, and then I steal your customers after 3 to 6 months. And you lose all this money. And I've got my business back and I'm laughing. Okay? How are you going to prevent that? How are you going to stop that?
An agreement that should you want to start against the restaurant, would it be from the vicinity of this one, or just don't at all?
Exactly. A non-compete. Okay? That I don't establish a restaurant of a similar type or whatever for X amount of time within Y amount of radius from your restaurant. Okay? It's a non-compete. Without the non-compete, you're unlikely to buy the restaurant. In fact, you'd be foolish to buy the restaurant. In fact, if your lawyer let you buy the restaurant without a non-compete, your lawyer would be negligent. Okay? Yeah. So you need these sorts of ancillary restraints, okay, to make the deal, the restaurant sale, go through. Okay? Similarly, if I'm selling you the restaurant, okay, you want my recipes. I've invested a lot of time and energy and effort in putting these recipes. That's what attracts the customer. And of course, my dynamic personality, no substitute. Okay? So you want the intellectual property. You perhaps want the logos. Okay? If it's the logo's well known or something like that, or certainly the name. Okay? So that's got to be. But that's really not the purpose. It's not a deal about IP. It's a deal about restaurant, but the IP is part of it. Okay? Now, generally speaking, well, no, not generally. Let's back up. Non-competes are obviously a restriction on competition. If I sign a non-compete clause as part of the sale of my restaurant, okay, I've agreed to stay off the market. It's restricting my opportunities to compete on the restaurant market, correct? That's the whole point. But it has a valid commercial reason. And as a result of this valid commercial reason, competition law and policy regards ancillary restraints as really falling outside of the competition law. So if something's a legitimate ancillary restraint to an otherwise perfectly competitive agreement, or to an agreement that doesn't hinder competition contrary to the competition rules, then that ancillary restraint is almost certainly permissible. Almost certainly, so long as it doesn't go too far. Obviously, the non-compete has to be restricted in terms of time and radius. But that's all relative to, of course, the scope of the primary contract. If, for instance, it's a local restaurant that draws customers from the local area, the non-compete range or radius should be smaller than, say, a destination restaurant that attracts people from hundreds of miles. Okay? The pro nuptia case, okay, this involves ancillary restraints. It also involves, we'll see it again when we talk about franchising. Okay? And in the context of a franchiser, a franchise agreement, as we will see later when we talk about vertical restraints, often contains a number of ancillary agreements or ancillary restrictions. Okay? And these ancillary restrictions, which are the know-how and assistance provided, not benefit competitioners, are all necessary, but they have to be strictly necessary for the operation of the business. Think of a franchise. Take a franchise. Think of a McDonald's. Okay? What do you have when you have a McDonald's? Other than regret after you've eaten. What do you have? Pardon? Branding. So the brands. You've got the IP, right? The recipes. Okay? You've got various of the McDonald's manuals about yay thick, about how, the way that these burgers are supposed to be prepared, even though they're now automated. Okay? So there needs to be confidentiality restrictions on all of this so that, okay, the assistance provided by the franchisor doesn't benefit competitors, so that that information doesn't somehow leak out to Burger King. Okay? So there's very restrictions on that. But they need to be necessary, sort of controlled to maintain the identity and reputation of the network. Okay. Okay. Non-competition clauses is not merely okay, and then this stresses on the other concern about a franchise is, would McDonald's be happy if you're a McDonald's franchisee and you bought a Burger King franchise? No, they'd be real unhappy, wouldn't they? Again, it's a non-compete, so that would be it. So buying a McDonald's franchise precludes you, means you can't limits your market freedom. Okay, but that's necessary, as the Ramia case says. Okay? And Ramia goes on, okay? And this is basically, this mirrors what I said about these non-competes and these ancillary restrictions having to be necessary in the circumstances. And this looks at a non-compete on a sale of business and the reason for it. Okay. So the clauses must be necessary for the transfer of the undertaking and the scope directly limited to that purpose. In other words, not broader than needed. And again, in the MasterCard case more recently, okay, restriction needs to be objectively necessary to the implementation. So if it's objectively necessary to the implementation and it's not too broad, it's perfectly fine. Okay? 101 will not concern itself with it. Okay? But if it's too broad or if it doesn't appear necessary and it can't be severed from the contract, then it's likely to draw the entire agreement into the 101 prohibition. Okay. Now, I'm going to stop in a minute. Object and effect. I'll begin with this next time. Okay. This is a fundamental distinction in 101. Okay. It's fundamental and it's confusing. The dividing line between an object restriction and an effect restriction is sometimes not very clear. To his credit, the Advocate General Bobek in the Budapest Bank case does a very good job of drawing that line with more clarity than I've ever seen it been done. Okay. Read the case. Read that I handed out to you. Okay? If there's one thing you need to read, it's this. That's why I handed it out to you. Okay, now, the consequences of a agreement being found to be restrictive by object and agreement are profound, and they're different from the consequences of an agreement being found restrictive by its effects. If an agreement, and we'll get this is just put your pens down because I'm going to do this in more detail on Monday. If an agreement is found to be restrictive by object, it is highly unlikely that it can ever be viewed as legal. If an agreement is restrictive by its effects, then it is probably going to be found legal. Okay? And I'll show you why on Monday. Please read the AG's opinion and read the relevant parts of the textbook on this. Okay? It does, just as an aside, in almost all circumstances, it will be part of a problem question. Okay? Okay, with this, we'll end the lecture. And I'll take any questions. No?
So if it's restricted by objects, then most likely illegal. If restricted by
Almost
effects,
certainly
most
illegal.
likely-
Yeah.
Okay.
And if by effects, probably legal. But it involves a lot of expense to prove it one way or the other, because you need a full-blown economic analysis. Okay, and that's a real problem, because economic analyses don't come cheap. Yes.
But it do have the recession.
Pardon?
But it do have the recession.
You have a?
Recession.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Now I owe you a minute of time for the next lecture. So, okay. Have a good remainder of the week.
How do you spell that? Delimited closing?
D-I-L-I-M-I-T-I-S.
Oh, I am. And also, I'm wondering, if it is the one used for contract, would it be unfair to the person use that one?
No, it's just unfair to the consumers. It would be unfair to the person. I mean, in the sense that they could have a court declare the contract void.
Okay, so
Yeah.
they would not get fined because.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because you.
Yeah. Okay, no, I'm afraid yes. It would allow for a damage claim.
Okay.
Okay, I wouldn't say unfair. you could sue on that basis. In fact, one of the claims on private damages was the UK's equivalent of the damages. It's called Courage and Freeharm, where a similar contract served as the basis for damage.
Okay. And also, I'm wondering that in this case, it can be severed from a contract.
It can't be severed, the entire contract.
Oh, can be.
Yeah, the entire contract comes within 1011.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
I just wanted to say sorry to reply to your email about my dissertation.
Oh, that was okay.
Yeah, but I was planning on doing
That's mandatory licensing over charities for okay? So for instance, if somebody's looking at the restaurant and they're agree. Okay? And if I want to just say the was the oil and grease patent, for instance, if I'm with that, has to allow me to use it. That's a fair reason to use this.
when you were giving me the list of topics, I was thinking, oh, I don't know, maybe I want to do about something else. I'm going to do it for a competition.
Or just say no. I don't,
Because I did a competition in I was really interested about
just have a read.
yeah, I think that's and then I'll let you know.
Sure, yeah, look, like I said, I think it's pretty
Yeah, I think you do. Well, thanks.
yeah, let me know, and I will, when are you required to have the time?
I think it's May. I've still got
In May? Oh, okay, I thought it was like next week or something.
Oh, no, I was just thinking about it.
Okay,
now.
good, okay. Okay, yeah, sure, just think about it, read about it, and then, like, email me, or if you want to have a longer discussion.
Oh, okay, yeah, well, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Okay, then, well, why don't we wait till Monday, and then it'll become more and more clear.
Okay, I will read through
Read through it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.